Hey everybody. This is the section from Baruch Knei-Paz's book, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. This is about Trotsky's ideas about political organization after 1905. So, our political tasks opened with a preface which Trotsky wrote towards the end of August 1904, immediately prior to the publication of the pamphlet and some months after the text itself had apparently been completed. By then, Lenin's ascendancy in the party had been considerably halted. Lenin's faction had suffered reverses, and it seemed that the danger of Bolshevism had been rolled back. Trotsky's preface made note of this fact and celebrated what its author hoped would be the end of internecine warfare. Trotsky now called for consideration and systematic work. But far from gloating over the apparent recovery of Menshevism, Trotsky argued that it should liquidate itself as a faction. The schisms of the past should be buried forever and one united social democratic party resurrected, not identified with any one narrow trend, but representing the overall outlook of social democracy. The, quote, conciliator in Trotsky was thus immediately at work. Footnote. Trotsky's, quote, conciliationism, end quote, came to the fore particularly after 1907, end footnote. But the split in the party was more embedded than Trotsky imagined, and, as the coming years were to show, all Trotsky's efforts would come to naught. In the meantime, however, events outside the party were beginning to transform the political environment in which it existed. Within a matter of months, it seemed to Trotsky, the dream of a radical working class was on its way to becoming a reality. What was both puzzling and encouraging was that insofar as such a reality was taking shape, that reality was taking shape independently of the party. Trotsky's assumption had been, and it was an assumption shared by all social democrats, that the radicalization of the workers would be a slow and drawn-out process, and Trotsky took it for granted that the party would play a central role in this process. Now it appeared clear to Trotsky that it was neither dependent on the party, nor was it the goal of an unspecified future. As we have seen, this new reality immediately took Trotsky's mind away from party matters. For the first time, Trotsky turned to a systematic analysis of Russian society, an analysis which ended with the theory of the permanent revolution. This, for Trotsky, constituted the unlocking of the puzzle and a justification for the encouragement Trotsky felt. Trotsky now had to admit, in contrast to what Trotsky still thought at the time of writing Our Political Tasks, that the objective conditions of the Russian working class were such as to make the prospects of revolution more, rather than less realistic than those of the European Revolution. In the course of his analysis of Russian conditions, Trotsky began to perceive also that the main problem of the social democratic movement would be not to pull the workers behind the social democratic movement, but to keep pace with the workers. This possibility, however, had already struck Trotsky in Our Political Tasks when Trotsky visualized a situation in which the workers, alienated by the party's inner squabblings and controversies, would, quote, turn their backs on it and go their own way. In 1905, it became clear that if the workers had not specifically rejected the party, the workers had at least unequivocally chosen to act outside the party's confines. The workers' movement was largely spontaneous indeed, and as the year 1905 unfolded, the Social Democratic Party seemed to be virtually an irrelevancy. Trotsky himself had by now severed most of his formal ties with the Mensheviks, so that Trotsky himself was already an independent figure. Trotsky's own subsequent experience, Trotsky's newly arrived at conception of the Russian Revolution, and the instability of the Social Democratic Party combined to reinforce Trotsky's pre-1905 view that the Bolshevik approach to party organization was totally mistaken. Section A. The Party and the Soviets. We have already dwelt on the extent to which the events of 1905 impressed upon Trotsky the view that the future of the workers' movement, including ultimately the socialist revolution, lay in mass action. If before 1905 such a view was still in the realm of theoretical argument, after 1905 it appeared to Trotsky to have been empirically vindicated. If anything, therefore, Trotsky's attitude became even more extreme. On the one hand, Trotsky now urged the complete reconstruction of the party in accordance with the new reality of a proletariat which had proved its capacity for both radical and mass participation in politics. Quote, "The gates of the party," end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, "must be flung wide open without fear of the proletarian elemental force," end quote, Trotsky. On the other hand, Trotsky became convinced that not even a reconstructed mass party could exhaust or even provide the framework for the organizational possibilities which now presented themselves. The experience of 1905, the experience of revolution, taught, Trotsky believed, that organizational instruments arise and are created in the very midst of revolution. One such instrument was the Soviet. The Soviet had been born in the heat of battle, and the Soviet, more than any other institution, had come to express the will of the workers. Trotsky's attitude toward the Soviet has been indicated in a previous chapter. And we return to it briefly here only to emphasize its effect on Trotsky's view of the role of the Social Democratic Party. The most interesting of Trotsky's writings in this connection are the sections previously referred to in Trotsky's book 1905, quote, "summing up," end quote, the lessons of that year. They show the extent to which Trotsky was prepared to forsake the concept of party and of organizational loyalty for the sake of mass effectiveness. At the beginning of 1905, Trotsky, as we have seen, had urged the Social Democratic Party to stand at the head of the workers and lead them. But the dangers Trotsky had warned of in 1903 and 1904, that internal splits and insufficient contact with the masses would isolate the party, had in Trotsky's view unfortunately materialized in 1905. The party was no longer suited to act as the vehicle for revolutionary leadership. What was needed now was an organization that could command the loyalty of the masses at a time when the masses were less interested in organizational and ideological niceties and more in effective action and solidarity. Thus Trotsky wrote the, quote, "creation of an impartial, bracket, non-party, end bracket, organization," end quote, was rendered, quote, "absolutely indispensable," end quote. Quote, "to have the authority of the masses on the very morrow of its formation, it had to be instituted on the basis of a very wide representation," end quote, Trotsky. Such an organization was the Soviet. In, quote, "summing up the essential nature of this intuition," Trotsky wrote, quote, "the Soviet organized the working masses, directed the political strikes and demonstrations, armed the workers, and protected the population against pogroms. Similar tasks were carried out by other revolutionary organizations before the Soviet came into being, concurrently with the Soviet and after the Soviet. But this did not give these revolutionary organizations the influence which the Soviet enjoyed. The secret of this influence lay in the fact that the Soviet grew organically out of the proletariat in the course of the proletariat's direct struggle for power as determined by actual events. If the workers themselves, on the one hand, and the reactionary press, on the other, gave the Soviet the name of, quote, "workers' government," end quote, this reflected the fact that the Soviet was in reality the embryo of a revolutionary government. The Soviet represented power insofar as power was assured by the revolutionary strength of the working class districts. The Soviet struggled directly for power insofar as power still remained in the hands of the military police monarchy," end quote, Trotsky. The Soviet, in Trotsky's view, had therefore become the workers' most natural organization. Did this mean that the Soviet had replaced the Social Democratic Party as the organ of the working class in time of revolution? In purely organizational terms, this was precisely what Trotsky now believed. The exigencies of revolution, the need for as wide a revolutionary front as possible, ruled out the narrow, clandestine basis of the party, but it did not rule out the influence of the party as the source of the Soviets and the revolution's ideology. If the Soviet was not the monopoly of social democracy, the Soviet was nevertheless governed by the ideas of social democracy, that is, the ideas of proletarian socialism, and insofar as the party remained loyal to its ideological roots, The party retained the capacity for influencing and even ultimately guiding the work of the Soviet. In a sense, though not in a formal sense, this is what happened, according to Trotsky. Quote, the party, from the outset, retained the possibility of exploiting the immense advantage deriving from the party's Marxist training, because the party was capable of clearly orienting the party's political thinking in the vast, quote, chaos. The party was able, almost without effort, to transform the Soviet, which formerly was a non-party organization, into the organizational instrument of the party's own influence, end quote. Trotsky. One can therefore summarize Trotsky's views on the Workers' Party-Soviet relationship as follows. In preparing for revolution, is the party which strives to educate and influence the workers. In carrying out a revolution, is the workers themselves who create the most appropriate organization, the Soviet. At such a time, it is the masses who, quote, sweep the party forward, end quote, a phenomenon which will, quote, will occur in every revolution, however powerful that revolution's organization, end quote. Trotsky. Concurrently, however, the party assumes the role of the source of theoretical and ideological inspiration, influence, and guidance. Put another way, the party is the organization of the workers during the pre-revolutionary period. The party ceases to be an organization during the revolutionary period and becomes an appendage to the workers and to the Soviet themselves. Footnote, a similar argument was developed by Trotsky in, something in Russian, published from 1907. This book is a collection of various articles and letters written during 1906. End footnote. This view of the party as providing a general program of social action while the masses themselves constitute the executive arm verges, of course, on the politically naive. But it indicates again how convinced Trotsky had become of the reality and viability of mass action. Footnote. In some piece, this article was Trotsky's first reaction to the events of January 1905. Trotsky declared, quote, how invincibly eloquent are facts, how utterly powerless are words. The masses have made themselves heard, ... The revolutionary masses are no more a theory. The revolutionary masses are a fact, end quote. A similar excitement at the prospect of mass revolutionary action overtook Trotsky even before January 1905. See the article written in December 1904, something in Russian. I think it translates as proletariat and revolution. End footnote. In the years after 1905, Trotsky held this view not out of idealistic or romantic considerations, but because Trotsky believed that this approach to the workers' movement offered the best prospects of success. Trotsky believed, in other words, that only a genuinely mass movement could bring about a socialist revolution. Simultaneously, this position was bound up with a wider revolutionary conception, the theory of permanent revolution, which Trotsky had formulated in the wake of 1905. That conception had been much influenced by the mass phenomena which Trotsky was a witness to in 1905, and one of its basic assumptions was that the Russian proletariat would act as a mass social and political force. As we have seen from Trotsky's 1905 and subsequent writings, Trotsky was not blind to the danger that a political party could assume a politically autonomous role. But Trotsky refused to believe that it could thereby control and dominate the workers. Rather, Trotsky believed that the reverse would happen. The years which followed 1905 were a period largely devoid of revolutionary activity. For Trotsky, as for the Russian revolutionary movement in general, although for Russia this was to be a period of far-reaching reforms, in local self-government, in education, and, above all, in agrarian policy, to Russian revolutionaries, it signified the, quote, years of reaction, end quote. Footnote. For a succinct account of the reforms of these years, see Harold Shukman's Lenin and the Russian Revolution, published in 1968, Chapter 6. For a brief assessment of Stolypin's reforms and economic changes after 1907, see Alexander Gerschenkron, Patterns of Economic Development, in C.E. Black's edited volume, The Transformation of Russian Society, published in 1960, and see the article by Harry T. Willits, the agrarian problem in George Katkov's edited volume, Russia Enters the 20th Century, 1894 to 1917, published in 1971. End footnote. The government's virtual, quote, coup d'etat of June 1907 and the subsequent renegation on its political concessions of 1905 put an end even to formal parliamentary agitation. Wikipedia says, the coup of June 1907 is the name commonly given to the dissolution of the Second State Duma of the Russian Empire. The arrest of some of its members and a fundamental change in the Russian electoral law by Tsar Nicholas II on the 16th of June, 1907. This act is considered by many historians to mark the end of the Russian Revolution of 1905 and was the subject of intense subsequent debate as to its legality. The coup of June 1907 also created a fundamental shift in the makeup of future Dumas in the Russian Empire. Whereas previous laws had given peasants and other low-class people a larger proportion of electors to the Duma, the new law transferred this to the propertied classes. In an effort to avoid election of the large number of liberal and revolutionary deputies who had dominated the first and second Dumas. Although it largely succeeded in this objective, it ultimately failed to preserve the imperial system which ceased to exist during the Russian Revolution of 1917. Back to the text. The revolutionary wave of 1905 not only subsided, it seemed to have exhausted itself. Amongst the intelligentsia, the earlier infatuation with politics was replaced by a withdrawal into less immediate and less concrete concerns. The former, quote, legal Marxists, later members of the Union of Liberation, among them Struve and Berdiaev, turned against revolution into religion. In literary and artistic circles, although this was to be a great period of innovation, there was a similar tendency towards concern for more ethereal matters, as represented by the growth of literary schools, such literary schools as symbolism. Wikipedia says Russian symbolism was an intellectual, literary, and artistic movement predominant at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Russian symbolism arose separately from West European symbolism and emphasized defamiliarization and the mysticism of sophiology. Back to the text. Moreover, in the wake of Stolypin's plans for the regeneration of Russia, national sentiments reasserted themselves. On the whole, there was at best a wait-and-see attitude, at worst a general resignation to the autocracy and a greater concern for personal security rather than the health of society as a whole. As for the social democratic movement itself, the social democratic movement was in shambles. The party held its fourth Congress in April 1906, and ostensibly some formal unity had been restored, but the Bolshevik faction continued to retain a separate organization and in the years that followed became more and more estranged from the rest of the party. Arguments over underground as against parliamentary activity, over, quote, liquidationism, unquote, Lenin's name for what he took to be a movement to destroy the party apparatus, as well as over the old issue of a revolutionary elite as against a mass movement, became even more intense and made reconciliation impossible. At any rate, Lenin himself was obviously not interested in unity, at least not on any terms but Lenin's own, and by 1912 Lenin resolved to turn his faction into an independent party, though claiming it for the RSDRP label. Against this, later in the same year, various, largely Menshevik, elements formed yet another grouping known as the, quote, August Bloc, which was, however, no more than a loose meeting of minds. The Bolsheviks, ostensibly more consolidated, were in fact plagued by internal splits and scandals. In 1908, a form of philosophical revolutionism, more metaphysical than political, formulated by Bogdanov, had threatened to distract the Bolsheviks from their traditional down-to-earth attitudes, and Lenin had had to fight it off with a major polemic. Footnote: this was his well-known Materialism and Empirio-criticism published in 1909. End footnote. In later years, the Bolsheviks went through a version of their own, quote, Azov affair, with the discovery in 1913 that their Duma leader, Roman Malinovsky, was a police agent. Wikipedia says Yevno Azov was a Russian socialist revolutionary who also operated as a double agent and agent provocateur. Yevno Azov worked as both an organizer of assassinations for the Socialist Revolutionary Party and a police spy for the Okhrana, the Russian Empire's secret police. Yevno Azov rose through the ranks to become the leader of the Socialist Revolutionary Party's terrorist branch, the SR Combat Organization, from 1904 to 1908. After the revolutionary Vladimir Berstev unmasked his activity in 1909, Azov fled to Germany, where he died in 1918. And let's look up Roman Malinovsky, shall we? Roman Malinovsky lived from 1876 to 1918. Roman Malinovsky was a prominent Bolshevik politician before the Russian Revolution, while at the same time working as the best-paid agent for the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. Roman Malinovsky codenamed him Portnoy, the tailor. Roman Malinovsky was a brilliant orator, tall, red-haired, yellow-eyed, and pockmarked. Quote, robust, ruddy complexion, vigorous, excitable, a heavy drinker, a gifted leader of men, end quote. Back to the text. No faction, therefore, was in a healthy state, and in spite of the numerous attempts at, quote, conciliation and rebuilding, this was the period during which the Russian social democratic movement reached its lowest depth. Membership figures dropped drastically, repression by the authorities became more efficient, and much of the leadership was forced to go into exile. In part, the troubles of the movement derived from its endemic factionalism and discord, but the underlying cause of its eclipse was the general decline of interest in political and certainly revolutionary activities. Footnote: a full account of the problems of the Social Democrats during the post-1905 period is given in Shapiro, chapters 4 to 7, also Schuchman, chapter 7, end footnote. The disarray in the movement naturally frustrated the effectiveness of its leading figures. Like everyone else, but perhaps more so, Trotsky was to suffer the effects of this general chaos within the revolutionary ranks. In 1905, Trotsky had reached the pinnacle of revolutionary activity. The year which followed was spent in prison, but it was a year of intensive thinking and writing during which Trotsky formulated the ideas that would become permanently associated with Trotsky's name. But now, as Trotsky's biographer has written, only the, quote, doldrums, end quote, awaited Trotsky. Footnote: this is the title Deutscher gives to the chapter of his biography of Trotsky dealing with the years 1907 to 14, end footnote. Trotsky had broken with both the main wings of the party already before 1905 and had made Trotsky's name independently without their assistance. In the years which are now to follow, Trotsky was to remain irreconcilably at odds with these wings. Trotsky had neither faction nor following, and Trotsky's own self-willed, contumacious nature, Trotsky's inability to submit to party discipline, made reconciliation impossible. Moreover, in the wake of the defeat and the reversals which the revolution was to offer, and the seeming quietism which overtook Russian society, Trotsky's bold, radical ideas, Trotsky's vision of a national uprising leading to a workers' government, appeared to be completely out of touch with reality. Hardly anyone was to take the theory of the permanent revolution seriously. For years, the general attitude towards the theory of permanent revolution would be that the theory of permanent revolution was a brilliant but eccentric product of a mind endowed with too much imagination. Footnote. See, for example, the criticisms of Trotsky in F.A. Cherevanin's book of 1907. End footnote. The pitiful condition of the social democratic movement was apparent to Trotsky immediately. Trotsky had returned to St. Petersburg in March 1907 after an adventurous escape from exile in Siberia, and from there via Finland, Trotsky made his way to London, where Trotsky attended the 5th Congress of the party. Footnote. Trotsky's own colorful account of his journey into exile and his escape from it is in 1905. It was also published in a separate edition under the title Tuda I Obratno. I have no idea if that's how you say it. 1919. The account is an excellent example of Trotsky's powers of description, even when, in this case, Trotsky was not writing about politics. End footnote. The Congress, which met in May 1907, was ostensibly that of a united party. In the course of the Congress's deliberations, however, it became clear how divided, in fact, the Congress's members were. No one could as yet guess that this would be the last Congress of the party in the form in which it had existed since the party's first Congress in 1898. But the depth of the split between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks was evident to all. Footnote. The next Congress, the 6th, was not to convene until 10 years later, 26th of July to the 3rd of August 1917, when it would be that of the Bolsheviks exclusively. In between, there would be a number of conferences of the party, at the 6th of which, in January 1912, the split would become final. End footnote. The main issue, as always, was the fundamental character of the movement, and as always, the factions could not agree. While the Mensheviks emphasized the need for building up a mass following, Lenin stuck to his conception of a clandestine organization. Trotsky stood outside the factions and equally castigated both. Although Trotsky's main address at the Congress was directed primarily against the Mensheviks, Trotsky was no less critical of Lenin's views. Footnote. The speech appears as an appendix in 1905 and will be referred to later in this chapter. End footnote. Trotsky was typically at odds with everyone and, no less typically, made this clearly known to all. Nevertheless, Trotsky was eager to bring about a reconciliation between the factions, since Trotsky believed that the strength and effectiveness of the party could only be assured through actual unity. This was in fact the policy that Trotsky was to propagate throughout the subsequent years. Although Trotsky remained more closely associated with the Mensheviks, Trotsky used their newspapers to denounce Lenin's factionalism. Trotsky became the chief, quote, conciliator, striving always to salvage a basis for unity. But no such basis existed in all Trotsky's attempts, such as the August Bloc of 1912, the August Bloc of 1920, but no such basis existed, and all Trotsky's attempts, such as the, quote, August Bloc of 1912, of which Trotsky was the main animator, only seemed to exacerbate the inward antagonism between the main protagonists. Worst of all, seeking a synthesis of the best of two worlds, Trotsky aroused and earned the antipathy of both worlds, sometimes alternately, sometimes simultaneously. Trotsky appeared as the enemy of each, and this appearance deepened Trotsky's isolation, paralyzed Trotsky's effectiveness, and frustrated Trotsky's ambitions. Then, as before and would happen again, albeit under different circumstances, Trotsky revealed an incapacity to make his way in the twisting corridors of party politics, and above all, an incapacity to emerge as a leader during mundane times. The result was that from 1907 to 1914, living in Vienna and occupying himself mainly with journalistic work, Trotsky failed completely to exert influence one way or another. Footnote. From October 1908 until From October 1908 until 1912, Trotsky edited the Viennese Pravda. Although Trotsky did not turn the Viennese Pravda into the organ of the Mensheviks, but used the Viennese Pravda instead for preaching party unity, the contributors to the paper were Mensheviks. In April 1912, the Bolsheviks began to publish a paper with the same name, thus ending the career of the Viennese Pravda and initiating that of its famous successor. The later Trotsky contributed to other newspapers, among them Luch and Kievskaya Misl, on political as well as cultural and literary subjects. Trotsky's articles in these newspapers were reprinted in volumes 4, 6, 8, and 9 of his Zochnenia. I don't know. End footnote. Section B, the party and intellectuals. But if, therefore, these were for Trotsky years of political stultification, from an intellectual and cultural point of view, this was to be a period for Trotsky of new influences and great personal development. Trotsky had first come to Europe in 1902, but Trotsky's sojourn then had been relatively brief, and at the time, events in Russia were developing so dramatically that it was hardly possible for Trotsky to immerse himself in the European milieu. Now, during Trotsky's second, quote, exile, there was to be not only more time, but also less to take Trotsky's mind off the European world. Although Trotsky considered the fact of political quiet in Russia to be the proverbial calm before the storm, there is not much that a Russian revolutionary could do in the meantime. Besides, unlike some Russian revolutionary émigrés, and particularly Lenin, who seemed to have been largely impervious to a change in environment and did not in any case allow it to divert them from their total immersion in Russian affairs, Trotsky was by nature open and receptive to new influences, and Trotsky's range of interest, as we shall see later in this study, was always variegated. It did not take Trotsky very long to become not only accustomed to the very different social and cultural milieu of Europe, but to feel himself completely at home in this new social and cultural European milieu. Footnote. His own description of this period and milieu is in his My Life. Trotsky easily broke out of the closed and narrow circle of Russian émigrés. Trotsky read European literature, visited the famous art galleries, perfected his knowledge of languages, especially German, and concurrently plunged into the affairs of European social democracy. Although temperamentally and politically Trotsky was often at odds with the leading European socialists of the time, the Adlers, Hilferding, Kautsky, Trotsky nevertheless struck up close friendships with them. Trotsky frequented literary gatherings and political meetings, partook of the local custom of long conversations in cafes, and wrote copiously about cultural matters. Footnote. Trotsky's sketches of these and other European personalities were later published together in a collection, something in Russian, published in 1919, and in his, and something else in Russian. Here, as well as in Trotsky's autobiography, Trotsky emphasized that the friendships were more intellectual than political. Trotsky saw the European socialists as fundamentally non-revolutionary. End footnote. Footnote. Trotsky's writings on literary and cultural matters, which originally appeared mainly in the journal Kievskaya Mysl, were later collected in Literature and Revolution, and something in Russian. I think that might be his collected works. I don't know. End footnote. Although these years were spent mostly in Vienna, Trotsky made numerous trips to other European centers, Paris, London, Munich, as well as to the European periphery, quote periphery, the Balkans. Footnote. No footnote. One of the results of this involvement in European cultural circles was that Trotsky developed a curious ambivalence towards the intellectual community and intellectuals in general. On the one hand, Trotsky was full of admiration, even awe, for the artistic, literary, and cognitive products of this community, and Trotsky himself sought to absorb its highest attainments. In fact, Trotsky was so overwhelmed by European standards and achievements that Trotsky developed almost an inferiority complex about most things Russian. Though, it should be added, Trotsky was not so humble as to think himself inferior. Together with this deference to European culture, however, there went a certain disdain for the European intelligentsia, the European intelligentsia's way of life, the European intelligentsia's somewhat easygoing and scholastic manner, the European intelligentsia's fundamental acceptance, as Trotsky saw it, of bourgeois institutions, and above all, its reluctance or at least hesitation to act in a forcefully political manner. Trotsky, the man of letters, was naturally drawn to the intellectual circles, but the revolutionary in Trotsky was repelled and perturbed, even alarmed, by what Trotsky considered to be their tempering influence on political struggle. This ambivalence had a direct impact on Trotsky's attitude towards intellectuals in politics, particularly in revolutionary politics. Trotsky became skeptical about the value of the intelligentsia's support for social democracy in general, and Russian social democracy in particular. In the case of Russian social democracy, Trotsky came to believe that the very inferiority which Trotsky attributed to the Russian intelligentsia made the Russian intelligentsia's involvement in the party organization and in the movement especially ominous. And all this had a direct relevance, of course, to the issue of the character and composition of the social democratic organization. In this connection, two of his articles from the period are particularly striking. The one, The Intelligentsia and Socialism, written in 1910, deals with the general subject of its title. The other, quote, Concerning the Intelligentsia, written in 1912, analyzes the specific case of Russian intellectuals and Russian socialism. The central thesis of the first article is that the intelligentsia was far less independent of the intelligentsia's immediate social and political environment, and that the intelligentsia itself liked to think. The central thesis of the first article is that the intelligentsia was far less independent of the intelligentsia's immediate social and political environment than the intelligentsia itself liked to think. The intelligentsia was, Trotsky argued, a social rather than a moral category, like every other occupational grouping. The European intelligentsia in particular, though the European intelligentsia had reached the heights of theoretical and critical thinking, had widened the European intelligentsia's ties with the established order rather than severing those ties with the established order. The special status which the intelligentsia enjoyed, the relative comforts the intelligentsia received, the intelligentsia owed to the benefaction of a bourgeois society wealthy enough to dispense such luxuries. An unequivocal commitment to socialism would involve a readiness to sacrifice such advantages, a readiness to accept the kind of equal, non-privileged conditions and treatment to which others were subject. It was not surprising, therefore, Trotsky continued, that the vast majority of the intelligentsia, by which Trotsky meant intellectuals, writers, and artists, and the professionally educated, had so far failed to join the socialist movement. The opportunities which modern bourgeois society offered the educated were far more enticing than the ideals of socialism. In fact, the quote, more definitely socialism has revealed its content, the more easily it has made it for each and all to understand its mission in history, the more decidedly have the intelligentsia recoiled from it, end quote. Trotsky. As for those intellectuals who had joined the socialist camp, even they continued to hold on to the prejudices which came from favored status. Trotsky did not distinguish between, quote, intellectuals and the concept of the, quote, intelligentsia, and treated the two interchangeably, even though Trotsky sometimes spoke of those involved in purely cognitive pursuits, thinkers, and sometimes of those involved in the professions, lawyers, doctors, etc. This lack of differentiation is a fault, of course, since Trotsky's criticism as to the dependence of the intelligentsia on bourgeois society is not uniformly valid. End footnote. As for those intellectuals who had joined the socialist camp, even the intelligentsia who joined the socialist camp, the intellectuals who joined the socialist camp, continued to hold on to the prejudices which came from favored status. It was significant, Trotsky claimed, that the first great influx of intellectuals into the socialist movement had taken place at the very beginning of the socialist movement's history, when the socialist movement was without a mass following. Then the intellectual's individualistic psychology could find an outlet in the scope which the movement provided for theoretical argument and purely ideological pursuits. As the movement grew, the more in fact the movement succeeded in drawing into the movement's ranks the mass of workers, the more difficult it became for the intellectual to retain the intellectual's prominence. The simultaneous shift from theoretical to practical work, the concrete application of the principles of collectivism, had similarly limited the prospects for individual activity and contributions. Discipline, self-restraint, organizational coordination had tempered the intellectual's enthusiasm and frustrated his personal ambitions. Quote, a worker comes to socialism as part of a whole, along with the workers' class, ... The intellectual, however, comes to socialism by severing that intellectual's class umbilical cord. As an individual, as a personality, and inevitably seeks to exert influence as an individual. But just here, the intellectual comes up against obstacles, and as time passes, the greater do these obstacles become. At the beginning of the social democratic movement, every intellectual who joined, even if not above the average, won for himself a place in the working class movement. Today, every newcomer finds, in the Western European countries, the colossal structure of working class democracy already in existence, ... The organizational apparatus of social democracy stands between the intelligentsia and socialism like a watershed, ... End quote. Trotsky. The growth of the socialist movement, in Trotsky's view, tended therefore to, quote, alienate, end quote, the intelligentsia. One of the results of this, if it did not lead to the outright abandonment of the movement, was the development amongst the socialist intelligentsia of an idealistic stream, which is accompanied either by a passivity towards revolutionary action in general, or else by pathetic individual acts of rebellion. In one case, it was the older, quote, ideologues who became merely onlookers. In the other, it was the young, particularly the students, who exhibited anarchic, though impassioned tendencies. See the last book referenced, which was in Russian. Footnote. See the last book referenced in Russian for Trotsky's analysis of the psychology of student revolutionism. Trotsky noted that the schizophrenic character of the student condition, rebellion against an older generation, and at the same time acceptance of the social and cultural benefits which that generation made possible. Trotsky pointed also to the fundamental romanticism of student politics. Student politics is quixotic, as in reference to Don Quixote qualities. The student politics instability, student politics fluctuations, student politics readiness to join any cause, whatever its ideological content, which promised an outlet for militantism. All this, he said, was, quote, characteristic not of a class or of an idea, but of an age group, end quote. The whole analysis reads as if it were a reaction to the student politics of the 1960s. Sorry, I have to copy that down because it's so good. Forgive me, there's going to be a slight pause here. One second. Sorry, I had to copy that down. That's too good. Where am I? If in his 1910 article Trotsky did not mention a further possible consequence of the intellectual's alienation from a mass movement, namely the emergence of a domineering vanguardism, this was perhaps because the very mass nature of European social democracy seemed to Trotsky to preclude such a possibility. But this was the very consequence which Trotsky emphasized in his essay of 2 years later when writing on the subject of the Russian intelligentsia. The article concerning the intelligentsia is perhaps one of the most unflattering portrayals ever drawn of the character of Russian culture and Russian culture's begetters. Although Trotsky was fully aware and admiring of the great achievements of 19th century Russian literature and arts and the poverty which he claimed permeated Russian social thought, the poverty which Trotsky claimed permeated Russian social thought symptomized for Trotsky the fundamental malaise of Russian culture. Comparing Russian social thought with that of Western Europe, Trotsky found Russian social thought to be primitive, imitative, and stylized, sometimes petrified in an imaginary past, as, for example, populism, and sometimes given to romantic and utopian flights of fancy into the future, as, for example, the anarchism of a Bakunin or a Tolstoy. In the context of the present chapter, however, it is not so much Trotsky's description of the poverty of Russian social thought as the peculiar character Trotsky attributed to the Russian intelligentsia that is relevant. Trotsky began the essay by asking why it was that the Russian intelligentsia was so obsessed with itself, so convinced of the Russian intelligentsia's superiority, so concerned with the Russian intelligentsia's historical mission, how was it, Trotsky wondered, that a book such as Ivanov Razumik's The History of Russian Social Thought could be written in which the whole of Russian history was identified with the intelligentsia? Let's see if anything comes up. It sounds like I see a Wikipedia for Razumnik Vasilievich Ivanov Razumnik, or Razumnik Ivanov Razumnik, was a Soviet Russian writer, philosopher, and literary critic, best known for his book History of Russian Social Thought, published in 1907 in 2 volumes, and the series of essays on post-revolution literary life in Soviet Russia. Back to the text. Whence the, quote, self-styled messianism, end quote, of the intelligentsia, the intelligentsia's belief that the intelligentsia will, quote, save the entire world from the coming kingdom of the Boers, end quote. The answer, Trotsky believed, lay in the, quote, fatal curse of Russian history, end quote, in the, quote, submissiveness of the peasant masses, and in the peasant masses, quote, backwardness, poverty, and cultural pauperism, end quote. The traditional docility of the masses' indifference, apathy, and complacency in the face of the worst miseries and injustices, isolated the intelligentsia's own tradition of protest and opposition, and the Western roots of the Russian intelligentsia's culture opened a chasm between the Russian intelligentsia and the masses, which was more pronounced, more abysmal, more abnormal than anywhere in the West. In its own country, the Russian intelligentsia found itself rootless, alienated, suspended above a hostile and uncomprehending environment. And as a result, the Russian intelligentsia had sought refuge in itself. Rejected, and at the same time repelled by, the masses, despairing of the abyss separating the intelligentsia and the people, the intelligentsia withdrew into the intelligentsia's own shell, and there wove, for the intelligentsia's self, an ethereal realm of ideas. Thus, the impractical, idealistic nature of the intelligentsia's thought, removed from all social reality, borrowing social ideas from Western sources and unable to plant those social ideas in Russian soil, the Russian intelligentsia turned those social ideas from Western sources into metaphysical abstracts. The concept of freedom, in the West rooted in definite social, political, and historical conditions, became for the Russian intelligentsia an absolute, an ideal form empty of all meaning, pursued as an aspiration of the soul, and not as a concrete political objective. Quote, in Europe, with Europe's cultural order and defined intellectual capital, ... you will not find absolute freedom, ... The activities of European political parties and the European political parties' leaders are determined by the nature of the objective situation. It is hardly the same with us, where the intelligentsia is not bound by anything, ... Quote, they, in Europe, are bound by plans, conventions, textbooks, programmatic definitions of class interest, while I am absolutely free amidst my social steps, ... The absolutely free Russian intelligent, ... learns from Europe, taking Europe's latest ideas and words, and then rebels against those ideas' stipulated, limited, quote, Western meaning. The Russian intellectual assimilates the latest ideas and words from Western Europe to his absolute, quote, freedom. In other words, the Russian intellectual empties those words and ideas of meaning, ... This, quote, freedom, end quote, hangs like a curse over the whole history of the Russian intelligentsia, end quote. Trotsky. This kind of seems like how Marx talks about idealism in Germany. And like the German ideology, but maybe I'm not an expert on that, so. Here we go. So, end quote, Trotsky. And how, in spite of its estrangement from social reality, had the intelligentsia managed to survive? Firstly, by means of, quote, terrible mortal exertions, concentrated asceticism, ... fanaticism in the world of ideas, relentless self-limitation, an opinionated and auspicious attitude, and unflagging surveillance of one's own purity, unquote. And, secondly, by making its conscience that of Russia, its history that of the country as a whole. Thus, its self-centeredness, its vanity, its obsession with itself, the, quote, fatal discrepancy between ideology and practical living social reality, end quote, had been transformed by the intelligentsia into a, quote, justification of its unabashed haughtiness, end quote. Footnote. This is a footnote that I missed, actually. Nevertheless, Trotsky added, being so severed from any concrete commitment, the intelligentsia could permit the intelligentsia's self frequent changes of ideological loyalties. Quote, it is well known that when it comes to the consistency of the intelligentsia's faith, the intelligentsia's refusal to swallow gnats hardly prevents it, the intelligentsia, from gulping down two-humped camels, end quote. End footnote. Thus also, the intelligentsia's sense of moral superiority, the intelligentsia's love-hate relationship with the masses, the intelligentsia's assumption of a special role and position in society, of a self-imposed mission, and the intelligentsia's presumption to represent the true soul and destiny of Russia, quote, look, end quote, they, the intelligentsia, say, quote, at the kind of people we are, special, chosen, anti-Philistine, seeking the city of the future. If we are to speak frankly and tell the whole truth, we must admit that the Russian people are savages. They don't wash their hands and don't rinse their water buckets. The intelligentsia, however, has suffered crucifixion for the people's welfare. It has taken all the anguish of the truth upon itself. For a century and a half, the intelligentsia has never hesitated to offer its very life for the passion that consumes it, end quote. End quote, Trotsky. Having once convinced itself, by way of compensation for its fundamental social estrangement, of its calling its, quote, chosen status, nothing in the realm of reality could divert the intelligentsia from the intelligentsia's self-defined purpose, neither the complacency nor even the opposition of the very masses it claimed to serve. If the Russian people were submissive to the established order, then the intelligentsia would pursue its, and their, supposed goals without them, and with ever greater zeal, and so it had done, according to Trotsky, but at the price of complete and hopeless political isolation, and insignificance, at best imaginary results, In the end, the intelligentsia's, quote, delusions of grandeur, and the intelligentsia's continued failures to arouse the masses, led to the emergence of the specifically Russian phenomenon of, quote, substitutionism, end quote. Presuming to represent the people, it soon identified itself with them. Quote, it has lived through entire cultural epochs. For the sake of the people, it has selected the roads of development, again for the people, end quote. At first, this phenomenon took the form of, quote, substitution, end quote, for a class, as in the case of the Decembrists. Quote, Count Rastopchin, one second. Once made the ironic comment about the Decembrist uprising of 1825 that in France the, quote, rabble, unquote, brought about a revolution to make the rabble's self equal with the aristocracy, whereas our aristocrats made a revolution in the interest of the, quote, rabble, end quote. The Decembrists acted out a part that the Russian intelligentsia has reenacted more than once. The Decembrists acted in a, quote, substitutive, end quote, fashion for the interest of a class that had not yet emerged in Russia. They, quote, substituted, end quote, themselves for bourgeois liberalism, end quote. Trotsky. And Wikipedia says, Count Fyodor Rostopchin lived from 1763 to 1826. Fyodor Rostopchin was a Russian statesman and general of the infantry who served as the Governor-General of Moscow during the French invasion of Russia. Count Fyodor Rostopchin was disgraced shortly after the Congress of Vienna, to which he had accompanied Tsar Alexander I. Fyodor Rostopchin appears as a character in Leo Tolstoy's 1869 novel, War and Peace, in which Fyodor Rostopchin is presented very unfavorably. Back to the text. Subsequently, this acting by proxy in the name of a social class was extended to cover the masses in general, and the phenomenon turned out to be characteristic of all Russian revolutionary movements, populism as well as Marxism. Quote, the substitution of non-existent or feebly developed classes, a function masking the social weakness of the intelligentsia, has now become an ideological necessity, for it and almost a political profession. At first, the aristocratic intelligentsia substituted the aristocratic intelligentsia's self for the, quote, rabble. Then the populist commoner substituted the populist commoner's self for the peasantry. Finally, the Marxist intelligent substituted the Marxist intelligence self for the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. Wow. There is, in all of this, the unmistakable ring, of course, of the Trotsky of 1904 of our political tasks. Then, too, Trotsky had found it necessary to stress the, quote, substitutionist, end quote, tendencies in Russian Marxism, particularly as these were expressed through Lenin and the Bolsheviks. In 1912, although Trotsky did not mention Lenin and the Bolsheviks, there were instead allusions to the former, quote, legal Marxists, Berdayev and Struve. Trotsky saw the problem of the Marxist leadership, the social composition and character of the Marxist leadership's members, in the wider context of Russian social history. Thus, the source of the elitist, vanguard tendencies was not only the social democratic revolutionary movement itself, nor just organizational arrangements, issues Trotsky had raised in 1904, but the whole tradition of Russian social movements. In this way, Trotsky linked the, quote, first Marxist circles, end quote, to Russia's revolutionary past. In particular, to populism, the populism, of course, of clandestine, conspiratorial, and elitist traditions. And beyond this, Trotsky showed that such traditions, which were for Trotsky the concrete political expression of social estrangement, were themselves directly linked to the specific conditions of Russian society, its general backwardness, the low cultural level of its masses, and its social formlessness, that is, the absence in it, until very late, of the structured, vital classes. This last was for Trotsky the crux of the matter. In Europe, with Europe's highly developed class structure in general, and it's highly organized. Because large and mature proletariat, no one could presume to substitute himself for the masses. On the contrary, the danger there was that social democracy would be too cautious, too tied down by its mass organizational base, too pedantic in its insistence on mass democracy and consent, and thus ultimately too conservative. Footnote. Trotsky noted that in 1908, Trotsky, quote, wrote a book on German social democracy for a Bolshevik printing house in St. Petersburg. There, for the second time, the first was in 1905, I set forth the idea that the gigantic machine of German social democracy might, at a critical moment for the bourgeois society, prove to be the mainstay of the conservative order, end quote. Trotsky. Unfortunately, it has proved impossible to locate a copy of this book, nor is it to be found in Trotsky's collected works, or Trotsky's Sochinenia. End footnote. In Russia, on the other hand, social backwardness, the weakness of the class structure, had encouraged isolated individuals to take it upon themselves to represent not so much a class as the, quote, idea of a class. Finally, in the article concerning the intelligentsia, Trotsky, by linking the issue of, quote, substitutionism to the psychology of the intelligentsia, revealed to what extent Trotsky had become suspicious of, quote, intellectuals in politics, and how far removed on this point, as on so many others, Trotsky was from Lenin. This suspiciousness extended not only to the Russian intelligentsia, as we have seen in his earlier 1910 essay. Trotsky was no less skeptical about the European intelligentsia, though for other reasons as well. In both cases, however, Trotsky distrusted the individual motives and ambitions of the intellectuals, especially of those who were unprepared to come to terms with what he believed to be the inherently mass character of the revolutionary movement. As always, therefore, Trotsky remained a champion of the masses and of the mass party in the movement. And again, as always, Trotsky was confident that it was just such a movement which was asserting itself in Russia. Concerning the, quote, substitutionism, end quote, of the intelligentsia into a historical curiosity. Quote, concerning the intelligentsia, end quote, for the most part an essay in despondency over Russia's past, concluded nevertheless with a typical optimistic flourish, quote, during the years of 1905 to 6, large social entities appeared on the historical scene, classes with their own interest and their own demands. At one stroke, Russian events leaped into world history, arousing a powerful response in Europe and in Asia. Political ideas ceased to be ethereal spirits wafted down from some ideological heaven. The epoch of the intelligentsia substitutionism came to an end, historically exhausting itself, ... It is nonsense to think that after a great effort, history must turn back on itself, ... The Karateev-like quality, the ahistorical character of our masses, has disappeared forever. There can be no returning to it, and together with this we are through for good with the apostolate of the intelligentsia, ... History does not repeat history's self. However great the intelligentsia's past significance may have been, henceforth the intelligentsia's role can be only auxiliary and subordinate. Heroic substitutionism is passing away with its epoch into eternity. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Trotsky's references to the character Platon Karateev in Tolstoy's War and Peace, who symbolizes the peasant's characteristics of submissiveness and obedience. And footnote. Footnote. The final words of the article are, the future will be wiser and stronger than the past. End footnote. This is a piece from Spark Notes. It says, though Platon Karateev makes only a brief appearance in a few chapters of War and Peace, Platon Karateev has won an admiration from readers and critics that has endured from the publication of War and Peace through the Soviet period up to the present day. One of the few peasants in the novel to whom Tolstoy gives deep individualized characterization. Platon Karateev represents the author's ideal of the simple, life-affirming philosophy of the Russian peasantry. Platon is the Russian name for Plato, the Greek philosopher. Platon lives in the moment, forgetful of the past and oblivious of the future, to the extent that Platon cannot even remember what he said a few minutes earlier. Platon's affinity with animals, like the little dog accompanying the Russian political prisoners, suggests that Platon Karateev, or Karataev, I don't know how to say it, suggests that he too lives by instinct rather than by reason. Platon Karateev spouts Russian proverbs that resound with wisdom. Overall, this characterization of an extraordinarily happy human being contrasts sharply with Pierre, who has been depressed and confused for dozens of chapters when he meets Platon. Platon thus appears as a kind of answer to Pierre's long spiritual questionings, living proof that the human search for contentment can be a successful one. I just want to look up real quick the Wikipedia for War and Peace as well. War and Peace is a literary work by the Russian author Lev Tolstoy. Set during the Napoleonic Wars, the work comprises both a fictional narrative and chapters in which Tolstoy discusses history and philosophy. An earlier version was published serially beginning in 1865, after which the entire book was rewritten and published in 1869. War and Peace is regarded, with Anna Karenina, I think it's Karenina, as Tolstoy's finest literary achievement, and it remains an internationally praised classic of world literature. War and Peace chronicles the French invasion of Russia and the French invasion of Russia's aftermath during the Napoleonic era. War and Peace uses 5 interlocking narratives following different Russian aristocratic families to illustrate Napoleon's impact on Tsarist society. Portions of an earlier version titled The Year 1805 were serialized in the Russian Messenger from 1865 to 1867 before the novel was published in its entirety in 1869. Tolstoy said that the best Russian literature does not conform to standards and hence hesitated to classify War and Peace, saying it is, quote, not a novel, even less is it a poem, and still less a historical chronicle, end quote. Large sections, especially the later chapters, are philosophical discussions rather than narrative. Tolstoy regarded Anna Karenina as his first true novel. Back to the text. Having so acutely portrayed the social roots of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, Trotsky in the end seemed to convert it into Trotsky in the end seemed to convert substitutionism into a mere historical episode. Even assuming that 1905 was a watershed in Russian history, did it necessarily follow that, quote, at one stroke, end quote, all that made for, quote, substitutionism, end quote, in Russian society and culture had been wiped out? Had everything in fact changed so suddenly and drastically? At the very least, a degree of cautious skepticism should have informed Trotsky's attitude toward 1905 and after. Instead, as Trotsky's final riposte, Trotsky chose, here as elsewhere, on this issue as on so many others, to make what was merely a declaration of faith. In the light of Trotsky's own analysis of the persistent conditions in Russia's history making for, quote, substitutionism, this declaration was a gross non sequitur. Once again, therefore, Trotsky's abiding optimism, Trotsky's faith in the historical process, betrayed Trotsky's better judgment. Trotsky refused to believe in the tenacity of old cultural patterns, and Trotsky was determined to believe in the power of the new. That's the end of this section. The next section is titled 1917 and After. Thank you so much for listening.